This is part 6 of the Ontario Hazelnut Ipm workshop series for 2021, Late Spring and Summer Insects. My name is Melanie Filitas and I am a horticulture integrated pest management specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Throughout this series, we will be discussing a number of pest problems common to Ontario hazelnut orchards, including their identification, how to monitor for them, and some general management practices. For general information on hazelnut scouting and where you can find additional resources, please refer to part 1 of this webinar series, Introduction to Hazelnut Ipm. In part 5 of this workshop series, I provided an overview of the main pests we found in Ontario hazelnuts to date. This slide summarizes those pests, both direct and indirect, grouped by the relative impact they have had on hazelnuts. For more information on this slide, please refer to that presentation. In the last presentation, we also showed you this slide. This shows the activity of various insect pests of hazelnut throughout the season within orchards, with the green bars indicating their peak periods of activity and the blue bars indicating times when they may or may not be active depending on environmental conditions. In this particular presentation, we're going to be focusing on those insects that tend to become active as temperatures start to warm in June. So that is indicated here by this line. And specifically what we're talking about are foliar mites, leafhoppers, Japanese beetle, oblique banded leaf roller, and fall webworm. I should mention though that many of the insects that we mentioned in our early spring pest will continue to feed into June and July, so they're still present, but they are covered in the last presentation. So we're going to start this presentation with Japanese beetle, which is probably the most obvious insect that you will encounter in a hazelnut orchard. It is a very, very large beetle with a shiny metallic body. It has reddish brown wings and a greenish head, and then it's got these white tufts around its abdomen. It's quite distinct. And adult Japanese beetles tend to feed in very large groups, both mating and feeding on a wide variety of host plants. They feed by eating the tender tissue in between the leaf veins, and as they remove it, leaving the veins behind, they leave this skeleton-like lacy appearance. So we tend to refer to that as skeletonizing the leaves. Mature hazelnuts, which have lots and lots of foliage, can tolerate a fair amount of damage by Japanese beetle, but in some cases where you have young hazelnut trees without a lot of foliage and you have large populations of Japanese beetle, you can get situations where they remove so much leaf material that it significantly affects the ability of the tree to produce enough energy for itself to survive through the winter. So the photo on the right comes from the Simcoe Research Station's experimental hazelnut orchard. This happened early on. There was just so many Japanese beetles that it completely defoliated the young trees, and it did really stunt them and slowed their development and the time before they could produce nuts. Japanese beetles overwinter as grubs in the soil. They overwinter fairly deep in the soil to escape the freezing temperatures, and then in the spring they move up and engage in a brief period of feeding and activity on the roots of various crops, such as turf or other horticultural crops. So in other crops, they are root pests. But for hazelnuts, they become a problem when they emerge as adults, which occurs approximately in mid-June. The exact timing depends on environmental conditions for the year. But when the adults emerge, they can fly quite long distances, and they will fly to a wide variety of host plants and feed, as I mentioned previously, in quite large groups. They remain on those host plants, feeding, mating, and laying eggs in the soil in surrounding areas until late summer. Those eggs laid in the soil will hatch and feed for a brief period in early September before they move down deeper into the soil to overwinter. So for hazelnuts, the period of most concern is this summer period when they are feeding on the leaf material. Monitoring for Japanese beetle should begin roughly in mid-June and extend through to harvest. Commercial traps are sold for Japanese beetles, such as the one in the lower left photo here, but they're really not necessary as the beetles are quite large and easily visible in the canopy. And they feed in these very large groups which they form to mate and cause fairly significant feeding damage. So that makes it quite easy to see the beetles. However, damage does tend to begin in the upper portion of the tree. So it's important if you have a very large or tall hazelnut tree to remember to look up at the top of the canopy to catch early infestations. As I mentioned earlier, it is young, establishing trees or stressed trees, such as those that have moisture stress or are infested with eastern filbert blight or other diseases, that tend to be the most susceptible to Japanese beetle damage. Older trees that are healthy tend to have more foliage and can tolerate quite a bit more defoliation. You can avoid Japanese beetles a little bit by trying to avoid locating new orchards near vineyards, turf, or grassy areas, which are preferred sites for feeding or for laying eggs. However, that won't completely eliminate Japanese beetle infestations if you live in an area with lots of Japanese beetle movements. We do not have any pesticides currently registered against Japanese beetles on hazelnuts. However, products that you may be applying for other pests, such as weevil, may have some efficacy against Japanese beetle. I'm also often asked about mass trapping as a means of controlling Japanese beetle. The idea behind this is to purchase many of those pheromone traps that I referred to and hanging them around the orchard with the idea that you are attracting the beetles to the traps and away from the trees. So in principle, that's a good idea, but the problem is the traps contain an extremely potent pheromone, and it has a tendency to actually attract more beetles to them than you would if you just had the trees there by themselves. So if you're not careful, your traps can fill up to the point where the beetles are not trapped, because as you can see in the lower right photo, the trap is so full of dead Japanese beetles that live beetles that are still being attracted by the pheromone land on the dead bodies and then just take off and move into the trees. So you can actually end up with a concentrated level of damage around those traps that is higher than you would have if you've never hung the traps to begin with. So if you're going to try this as a technique, you want to make sure to never have the traps directly in the hazelnut crop. You want to locate them well away from the crop, outside the orchard, and you want to be changing them extremely frequently to get those dead beetles out. There are some traps that are being sold with larger vessels for containing the Japanese beetles, but just overall, it's not necessarily a surefire way of controlling Japanese beetles in the crop, and it can cause more problems than you started with to begin with. In the last presentation on early season pests, we discussed bud mites, which attack the buds, but there are also a number of species of foliar mites that will feed on the underside of hazelnut leaves, and they will cause some damage, however, not anywhere near the extent that bud mites cause on hazelnut buds. There are many species of foliar mites found on hazelnut leaves worldwide. Some of them are beneficial and some of them are pests, but the species diversity is quite large. In fact, I found it to be broader than on many other horticultural crops that I have observed in Ontario. Many of these species are common to other horticultural crops. They have a very wide host range. So there's the two-spotted spider mite and European red mite that are common on other tree fruit in Ontario. But probably the most common species causing damage in Ontario would be the hazelnut mite, which is a bit more specific to hazelnuts. Mites are favored by hot, dry conditions, and the warmer the temperature, the faster their development and the faster you develop damaging populations on any horticultural crop. Mites feed by scraping fluids from plant cells, and this causes a sort of discoloration and stippling, which are yellow or whitish spots that can lead to a general bronzing. I just want to go back to this slide to show some of the general damage you might get with a severe infestation of mites. So on the photo on the right, some of the leaves show that general stippling that you get from initial mite feeding. When it gets very severe, you can have a more distinct bronzing on the upper surface of the leaves. If you have spider mites present, you can also get a distinct webbing on the leaf underside, and you can see that on the left photo, but not all mites cause this kind of webbing. So you really need to look at the leaf with a high magnification lens to pick up some of the mite species that are present. The mite on the left is the hazelnut mite. The Latin name is Tetranecopsis Heridis. As I mentioned earlier, it is the main species that can build to large populations on hazelnut leaves. It is more specific to hazelnuts than some of the other species that might be present. You can see in the photo it is reddish with quite long hairs that are mounted on some prominent projections on the body. The eggs are also reddish. It is quite small, so you need a hand lens to really pick it out well. It can cause occasional leaf bronzing with very high populations, as you can see in the photo there with the bronzing leaves, but it is quite rare to get that level of damage on hazelnuts. I've only seen damage like that once in the last 10 years that I've been monitoring hazelnuts. For the most part, hazelnut mite and other foliar mites are kept reasonably well under control by beneficial insects present in the orchard. However, if the beneficial insect activity is disrupted, you may get damaging populations. I mentioned that other species are also present to less degree. In particular, the European red mite and two-spotted spider mite can be observed on hazelnut leaves to less degree than the hazelnut mite. You can use the photos to help identify them, and if you want more information on those species, you can go to the OMAFRA website and look at some of the crop IPM information for apples, which have more detailed information on identifying those species, but they are less common on hazelnuts than on apples and tender fruit. You should start monitoring for foliar mites on hazelnuts in mid to late spring, especially once temperatures really start to heat up, because that's when populations will increase. Focus on the leaf undersides, that's where mites tend to concentrate. And you're going to need 25 to 40 times magnification hand lens to really see them because they're quite small. We like to use a dissecting microscope when we're monitoring for mites. You can get some cheaper versions online, or you can get a Wi-Fi microscope that connects to your computer for about 30 to 40 bucks online. There are no established thresholds anywhere for foliar mites on hazelnut leaves. However, control is very rarely required in hazelnuts. However, if you've had a previous year where you've seen considerable bronzing, then you might want to be looking more closely. And if you see significant mite populations or mite damage early in the season, especially where you think nut development might be affected, that might be the time to consider a control. But you need to take into account predatory mite activity. They can be quite effective in keeping foliar mite pests under control. They can be more difficult to distinguish predatory mites from pest mites on hazelnut leaves than on some other fruit crops, just because there's such a large diversity of mite species on hazelnut leaves. But in general, predatory mites tend to be larger than pest mites. They tend to move much more quickly. So that can help you in figuring out if you have predatory mite presence. But because of this high level of activity from predatory mites, hazelnut trees so far appear to be able to tolerate really considerable populations of foliar mites before controls are required. So this is just a close-up of the severe bronzing that can rarely occur on hazelnut leaves with very high levels of mite infestation. Again, we've only seen this once in 10 years of monitoring hazelnuts, but that year we did get some bronzing on the nuts themselves from that mite feeding. So it is possible that this can occur, but it is quite rare on hazelnuts. I'm going to briefly mention the potato leafhopper. This is a very common insect pest with an extremely wide host range. It can be quite damaging on a number of horticultural crops in Ontario, but not so much on hazelnuts. This is another sucking, piercing insect that drains fluids from the leaves of a wide variety of crops, very similar to aphids. However, this is a more active insect. It's yellow-green and kind of wedge-shaped, so different shape and appearance, and they're very, very active. As you approach a tree that has leafhoppers, the leafhoppers will often fly away. The nymphs themselves, which are in the photo on the upper right, are wingless. They don't fly away when you approach the leaf, but they are also extremely active. So if you disturb them, they will move rapidly from side to side in a kind of distinctive motion that's unique to leafhoppers. While we do see these on hazelnuts, they are not as common as aphids or many of the other insect pests that I have mentioned. When leafhoppers feed on plant leaves, they inject a toxin into the leaf, which blocks the normal movement of water and nutrients to the affected area of the leaf and beyond. So what you get is a yellowing along the leaf margins, which extends into the leaf and eventually becomes brittle and brown and necrotic. So it starts as a very distinctive V-shaped pattern emanating from the tip of the leaf, which is commonly referred to as hopper burn. This is common on a large number of plant species, but on hazelnuts, populations rarely build up to damaging levels. So this damage is not that common on hazelnut trees. Although high levels of leafhopper populations are uncommon on hazelnuts, they do occur on the tree, so it's a good idea to be monitoring for them. Leafhoppers don't overwinter in Ontario. They are carried by air currents in late spring, and they generally land first on hay and feed on the hay. And we typically see movement onto other horticultural crops early to mid-June after the first cut of the hay. So they leave the hay, they move into a wide variety of crops. They will sometimes settle on tree nuts, and then they'll stay there and feed and have 2 to 4 more generations. So initially, leafhoppers will arrive in the edge of the orchard and move inwards. You want to be focusing initially on your perimeter trees and looking for adults, but adults are easily disturbed and they'll fly off the leaf as you approach the tree. So you can detect adults by tapping, which is discussed in the first webinar in this series. But another way to check for them is for the nymphs themselves, which can be found on the underside of leaves as you flip them over, looking for mites and aphids and other things. There are no thresholds for leafhoppers on hazelnuts, but control is really rarely required because they aren't that common. The main time you might be concerned about leafhoppers on hazelnuts would be if you have a newly established planting that has become infested, and that would most commonly be where a young orchard was located near a hay crop and there were no other desirable crops in the vicinity, and then the leafhoppers might then invade the trees and cause some damage. On to our next pest, the oblique banded leaf roller, or OBLR for short. OBLR is reported to cause crop damage in Oregon hazelnuts, and it's also a well-known pest of apples and other fruit crops in Ontario. We did mention it in the last presentation on early spring insects because it does do feeding to the leaves earlier in the season. However, there's a second generation that occurs later in the season, and that's what we're going to focus on here. We have trapped for OBLR in Ontario hazelnuts for several years, and in this slide I'm showing you some counts from 6 different orchards in 2015. And what you can see is essentially the numbers are extremely variable. They go up and down from very, very low to a high of about 45 in a single week. What does that mean for damage? Well, we don't have any action thresholds for Ontario, but we do have some thresholds coming out of Oregon. What you can see is their guideline is to apply controls when adult pheromone catches are 40 moths a week or more, and when you have larvae feeding on the nuts. So the relevance to Ontario here is that it's pretty rare for populations to exceed that Oregon threshold level. So for the most part, they don't seem to be increasing to really damaging populations in hazelnuts yet. However, we do need to be watching out for this insect, especially as our acreage increases, because there are orchards going in tender fruit growing regions and apple growing regions where there's already a lot of OBLR present. Just want to give you a brief overview of the life cycle of OBLR. The larvae overwinter and crevices in the bark, and from shoot elongation through late May, those overwintering larvae will become active and they'll feed on buds and new leaves, but they cause fairly limited damage. The larvae will then pupate and eventually become adults, which mate and lay eggs through June and July. By early July, the eggs of that summer generation will hatch into larvae, and those larvae will feed for 6 to 8 weeks, mainly on the leaves. However, in Oregon, they can be a problem when the leaves they are feeding on are adjacent to a nut cluster, especially if it has soft developing nuts, in which case they can feed on the nut shells underneath the husk. That summer generation then pupates and emerges as adults later in the summer, which will then lay eggs that emerge as larvae and feed briefly on the leaves before overwintering. So for hazelnuts, what we're really concerned with is that summer generation of larvae, particularly if it overwinters with the period where you have soft developing nut shells under the husk. Here are some examples of damage by OBLR. It is a leaf roller, so it rolls the leaves over, typically into loose curls that are associated with webbing that it uses to pull the leaf over itself. You can see some of that in the 2 left photos. Often you'll see signs of insect excrement called frass within those rolled leaves. Sometimes you will see the insects. And the feeding on the leaves causes these little window pane type holes, as you're seeing in the lower left photo. Sometimes as they get larger, we do see some chewing as well within and around the leaf, as you can see on the upper left photo. The main problem from this insect occurs when the leaves are adjacent to developing fruits. So we don't have a lot of photos of nut damage for hazelnuts, but the upper right photo is a good example of what happens on an apple. Because the leaf cluster was around the outside of that apple, you get these shallow feeding scars on the surface of the fruit. And the same thing can happen with hazelnuts if the feeding site is within a nut cluster. So you can see on the lower right photo, you get scarring and staining of the shell, and that early damage can occasionally cause nut drop, as reported from Oregon. However, it's just generally those young developing nuts with soft shells that are affected. If feeding happens after the shells have hardened later in the season, they're not going to be able to damage the surface of the nut as severely. The early feeding is the concern. To date, though, we have not really seen much direct nut damage from OBLR and Ontario hazelnuts. Feeding seems to be restricted to the leaves. To help you identify the insect on your trees, I'm showing you the eggs and larvae here. The eggs are found on the upper surface of the leaf. They're quite small. They look something like overlapping scales and are yellow to green in color. The larvae are generally found within those curled leaves we showed you in the last slide. They have a yellow to greenish body with a dark brown head and what's called a prothoracic shield, which is just behind the head on the shoulders. The area between that shield and the head is generally a whitish cream in color. You won't typically see the adults flying around in the orchard or landing on the trees, but you can catch them with pheromone traps. They're light to tan, dark brown with these dark bands running along the forewings. The male wingspan can range from 16 to 22 millimeters, but again, they're night flyers, so you don't typically see them in the orchard. On the right there, you can see what they tend to look like on the pheromone traps. Onto monitoring. We have no established protocols for monitoring OBLR in Ontario, so we're just really using what's been established in Oregon. For the larvae, you want to be looking for them between spring and early August, but again, the damaging populations are that summer generation as the nutshells are developing. So the general recommendation from Oregon is to look at 3 leaf clusters on each of 3 terminals per tree, typically on about 10 trees per orchard. And the threshold for action in Oregon would be 20 to 25% of the terminals being infested with OBLR. Adults can be monitored with pheromone traps, which can be purchased from a number of suppliers in Canada and the northeastern United States. They consist of these traps, which I'm showing on the left, which were discussed in the first webinar in this series on general IPM. You place about 1 trap every 5 acres of orchard, and you put them about 6 feet high in the orchard because the threshold also relies on damage to the nuts. So you want to be looking where the nut clusters are. You also want to be looking for nut clusters at the same time. And as I mentioned earlier, in Oregon, the threshold is 40 moths per week plus presence of larvae feeding on the nuts themselves. However, these thresholds are based on the West Coast and they may need to be modified for Ontario. But certainly the limited data we have so far suggests that even when we have 40 moths per week, we see very little feeding on the nut clusters. It's possible that with OBLR in Ontario, the activity occurs more after the nutshells have gotten too hard for them to cause damage. So there are a number, though, of products that are registered for OBLR in Ontario. So if you are concerned about nut damage, you can consider application of those products, particularly if you think you've seen damage from this insect in previous years. In the last presentation on early spring insects, we talked about the spring feeding caterpillar complex, which are a number of species that are active from bud break through to around the end of June. There is an additional species of caterpillar that's not part of this complex that can be problematic on hazelnuts, and that's a late season feeder that doesn't appear until July. And that's the fall webworm, Hyphantria Cunia, which is known for its tents that it produces on the trees. We do see populations of this insect on hazelnuts in Ontario every year, and they can be quite alarming for growers because they can build up generally on individual trees and cause some damage. So as I mentioned, the fall webworm is a late season feeder. It generally appears in early to late July, depending on the year, and like many of the other species attacking hazelnuts, it has a very wide host range. The caterpillars themselves are yellow to brown. They're quite hairy, and they often have dark spots along the body. So they tend to feed in large groups, in large prominent tents of webbing that encompass the foliage on the ends of branches, and as the caterpillars feed and grow, they expand their tents to encompass more and more foliage every few days. The heavy feeding by fall webworm and the defoliation that they cause, it tends to be constrained within that webbing. Fall webworm also has boom and bust cycles like the gypsy moth and other spring feeders, so they'll go higher and lower depending on the year. But again, the defoliation, though, is constrained within those tents. So in general, manually removing those masses of webbing is sufficient to control the caterpillars, and often may be better than a spray. There is nothing actually registered for control of fall webworm on hazelnuts. However, even if there were, the sprays won't penetrate that webbing to get to the caterpillars. Natural enemies are also quite active in these tents, and so it may be hard to make out, but in the lower photo, you can see these two brown blobs, which I'm circling here. Those are actually stink bugs, and they're inside the tent. So they're stink bug nymphs. They move inside the webbing, and they're consuming the caterpillars in that webbing. And so they do really help to keep these populations under control. However, you can get inadvertent damage from fall webworm caterpillars when their tent surrounds a developing nut cluster. So far, this isn't often observed in Ontario hazelnuts. However, what we can have happen is if fall webworm occur earlier in the season than normal, before the nuts have hardened, and the tent is enclosing a nut cluster, as it is in the case of the lower left photo. And so you still have some soft nuts in there, and then the caterpillars go in and they've really defoliated all the leaves within the tent. Then they will on occasion feed on those soft nuts, and they can do a fair amount of damage, as you can see from the other photos in this image. So far in Ontario, that's quite rare. They tend to limit their feeding to the leaves. However, there are some reports sporadically that I've seen from Europe that indicate that they consider it a direct pest of hazelnuts in some cases. We have not seen that happen in Ontario. So to date, they tend to be constricted to tents on certain trees, and they're more easily controlled by just pulling the webs off when you see them. Before we finish our presentation, I do want to mention a few other insect species that you do commonly see on hazelnuts, and I tend to get lots of questions about them. I want to cover them just so you know what they are, but none of these insects ever really become significantly damaging to hazelnuts, so they don't generally require any intervention. The first one is the pale green weevil. This insect is found on a very wide variety of fruit crops, including tree nuts such as hazelnuts. They will feed on the trees starting around May into June, and they generally only feed for a few weeks. They will leave a little bit of a ragged appearance to some of the leaves or some notching, and you see them moving around the leaves throughout the spring. However, the trees tend to be able to compensate for that damage, that limited damage by this weevil, with increased growth. So generally a control is not required for this pest. However, an inexperienced person might confuse the pale green weevil with the hazelnut weevil, which is a more serious pest that I will cover in the Pests to Watch Out for. The hazelnut weevil is not green, and the pale green weevil has a very short snout, whereas the hazelnut weevil has a very long, thin, curved snout. So those are the ways you can distinguish between the pale green weevil, which is not really a significant pest, from the hazelnut weevil, which can be a direct insect pest of the nuts. And if that one occurs in large numbers, you do need to be concerned about it. Another insect which we see from time to time on hazelnut trees is the Birch Sawfly. These look like little green caterpillars, but in fact, they're not caterpillars. They're actually relatives of bees and wasps. If you really want to know if you're dealing with a sawfly instead of a caterpillar, you'd have to look at their prolegs. So prolegs are these little fake legs. They're soft, fleshy appendages that appear at the rear of their abdomen, so at the rear end of the body. Sawflies have 6 or more pairs of these prolegs, whereas caterpillars have 2 to 5. So sawflies have more prolegs. Another distinctive feature for sawflies, though, is that when they feel threatened, they tend to raise their abdomens up and arch their body over. So the abdomen is actually flipped up over their heads or over their backs. And so the sawflies are doing that in the photo here. They tend to live in groups and they will feed together along leaf edges, but their damage is quite localized. The defoliation is rarely significant, but it can be initially alarming for a grower to see that level of damage, but this damage doesn't spread. It tends to be limited to the area where they are feeding, that localized gregarious feeding. If you're really concerned about damage from a sawfly on a particular area of a branch, you can always prune out the leaves or damaged area because the larvae will be pruned out with it. The blotch leaf miner is another insect that we see quite a bit on hazelnuts, especially in orchards that are near woody areas or hedgerows. The reason that I want to mention them is because the feeding blotches can look a little bit like lesions, so you initially might be concerned that you're dealing with a disease, when in fact what you're dealing with is a caterpillar. So this caterpillar actually feeds internally between the upper and lower leaf tissue, and it removes all the chlorophyll in the upper leaf tissue above where it's feeding. So it leaves this cleared area that looks somewhat lesion-like. If you want to confirm that you're dealing with this insect, you just scrape off that upper tissue, and if the caterpillar is still present, you'll see it lying there, as you can see in the left photo. But even if it's not there, you will always see large quantities of its excrement or frass, which it leaves over. And so if you find that there, that's an indication that what you're dealing with is a blotch leaf miner and not a disease. You do find them on many different species, but on hazelnuts, they don't seem to have any significant impact on tree health or productivity. Finally, I just want to show you the birch and beech girdler. This is another insect that will attack a wide variety of tree species, but we have seen it on hazelnut, and it has only occurred on one hazelnut orchard so far. However, it can cause extensive damage to young trees. So in this case, the adults lay their eggs within the tree. They bore into the trees to deposit their eggs. The larvae develop within the tree, feeding inside it, and that damage can actually girdle and kill young trees. For this particular hazelnut orchard, it was quite damaging, but fortunately so far it's been quite rare in hazelnut orchards. We haven't seen these in other orchards. However, it is a reminder that there are other things that can damage branches and trees other than the major diseases such as filbert blight that we are mostly concerned with in hazelnuts. So if you're seeing similar symptoms, but you're not finding bacterial or eastern filbert blight, then you might want to also consider insect activity and look for things like holes in the wood that can be indicative of the activity of boring insects. So that concludes our presentation on the main late season pests that you will see in hazelnuts. However, I did want to include this slide on holes in nuts because there are several insect species that will attack nuts throughout the season and result in empty nuts with holes or other symptoms at harvest. So if you're not looking for them through the season when they're active, then when you get nut holes at harvest, you will not really be able to identify what caused the problem. These are common in other hazelnut growing regions and have been reported there. We know they occur in Ontario, but fortunately so far we have not encountered many of these in Ontario hazelnuts. So I haven't included them in this presentation because they're not common. But because they can be problematic in hazelnuts in other growing regions, we do have a presentation on a separate presentation on them in this series. That would be the next one, and that's called Pests to Watch Out For. So I would encourage you to check that presentation, as it is likely that as hazelnut acreage increases in Ontario, we will start to see these pests. For later season insects, it's more likely to be brown marmorated stink bug and filbert worm that you will see in the orchard. Hazelnut weevil tends to be more active as adults earlier in the season, but all three are covered in this next presentation. If you're interested in finding more information on crop protection products for tree nuts, including hazelnuts, then you can refer to these resources on our website at www.ontario.ca/crops. Further details on pests are contained in the Guide to Hazelnut Production in Ontario, which will be posted on the OMAFRA website in the summer of 2021. And with that, I thank you for listening. I've included my contact information should you wish to reach out with questions or comments. And I also encourage you to subscribe to our blog at onspecialtycrops.ca, where we post timely information on agronomic and pest management information pertaining to specialty crops, including hazelnuts.